It is my distinct pleasure this evening to welcome you here in the room, and also, of course, those of you who are online, to our inaugural Edward Hagop Nororian annual lecture. This annual lecture series, as well as the Edward Hagop Nororian Scholarship Fund, which is a merit scholarship that will be awarded yearly to one of our best and brightest undergraduate students, was established with the generous gift of Miss Jane Plasman to honor the memory and character, as well as the many achievement of her late husband of 35 years. Ms. Plasman is a Michigan alumni who graduated from LSNA with a degree in speech pathology and audiology. And she and Edward's daughter Cheryl Nororian are here with us this evening in person. And I would like to say a special welcome to the two of you. And thank you for joining us for this beautiful, beautiful event. And thank you for your support. But before I begin, I would like to say a few things about Mr. Nororian, whom I got to know over lunch very well, I think, and who we are honoring this evening. Edward Hagop Nororian was born in 1928 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, to immigrant Armenian parents of quite modest means. He joined the military at a young age, and after completing his service, he earned a bachelor degree in history from Long Island University. And as I've learned today, and as I kind of had the sense already, it seemed that Edward was really, or Ed, as he's being referred to by his wife, was set on becoming a historian as he enrolled at Columbia University, from where he graduated with an MA in history. But there was something, and I think that while he was studying in New York, he was more and more drawn to the growing challenges of healthcare and courageously changed his career trajectory. And I'm sure my parents would have looked at me favorably if I would have done the same. And he enrolled in a master's degree in public health at Yale University. Here, with a keen eye to really historical context and equipped with a degree from Yale, he took on a series of hospital administrative positions in New York. And he made really great strides as he moved from, as I've learned, his humble beginnings as a teenage elevator operator at the Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, with many, many, many stops in between to become a leading figure in the public health arena, and eventually serving as executive vice president and chief operating officer at the same premier hospital where he got his start. There he relentlessly addressed what he saw was needed as an expansion of patient care, taking steps to modernize the medical center, build a new community hospital, develop a nursing home, set up home healthcare agencies, and pioneered a high-risk patient referral center. Somewhat unusual for a senior executive, if we are cynical, he cared very much about the people with whom he worked. And it's clear that he very much cared about history. He cared about his Armenian heritage as well. And he cared about education, the three elements that Cheryl just shared with us. It was education, history, and the third one, now it's escaping me. But that passion for history never left. And I find that so fascinating that eventually he would take his children on trips and talk about everything he saw around him and had read up on it and shared all of that knowledge with his children and his wife on these travels. So the bug for travel, as Jane was telling me, was there and always there, and it was accompanied with a journey in history, whoever was accompanying him on the way. So we indulge Mr. Nororian's passion for history this evening with a very special guest, Dr. Kate Franklin. But before I introduce Dr. Franklin, I want to like to thank, of course, our center specialist, Naira Tumanian, who is, as always, hard at work on putting everything together. We wouldn't do anything without her. And also to my colleagues, Michael Pfeiffer, who's here in the room, and Catherine Babayan, who's joining us online, for introducing me to the work of Dr. Franklin, because it has been a really great pleasure to encounter it in so many different ways. And of course, I want to thank Kate for being here and making the journey across the ocean from the UK. So I'm very glad that you were willing to make this travel and to join us here in person today on this very special occasion. Who's Dr. Franklin? She is an anthropologist, an archaeologist. I think she's also a little bit of a literary scholar, a historian for sure, and an indiscriminate enthusiast for speculative fiction. If you ever wanted to meet someone who takes interdisciplinarity serious, you will meet someone in just a few minutes. And with degrees from Yale and Oxford in archaeology and in anthropology PhD from the University of Chicago, we might say that she is more than well qualified interdisciplinarian. She's teaching her multifaceted craft as a lecturer in medieval history at Birkbeck College at the University of London, and has held the prestigious Dumanian visiting professor in Armenian studies in the Armenian Studies Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization at the University of Chicago. Following her passions for the past as it lives in the present, she has dug up treasures and lots of dirt across the South Caucasus and Central Asia. She's a prolific scholar. Her work has been published in many peer-reviewed journals, such as the Armenian Journal for Near Eastern Studies, the Journal for Cultural Heritage, and she's currently working on an article that's beautifully titled, wait for it, From Monsters to Motels, Imagined Infrastructural Worlds of Silk Road Travel. So she's also co-authoring a book on the environment and landscapes of the Middle Ages. And today's lecture, Imagined Landscapes and Crafted Worlds, Space-Time and Nature Culture in Medieval Armenia, is based on Dr. Franklin's 2021 monograph. And the monograph is titled Everyday Cosmopolitanism, Living the Silk Road in Medieval Armenia, which was published by the University of California Press, and it's available online. You can download it. It's a free access work, and I hope that everyone will be intrigued enough to go home and click that button and indulge everyday cosmopolitanism, as it is a layered work that relies on an intricate weaving together of a literary analysis of travelogues spanning the 5th century to the 20th century, in combination with that of medieval manuscripts, engravings, and of course data produced from all of those archaeological excavations over the last century and a half. Working across these sources, Dr. Franklin introduces the Silk Road as an imagined and gendered topography. The goal is to uncouple our historical idea of the Silk Road from narrative projects established by patriarchal norms, beginning with the question, how did narratives of medieval travel that are male and global, epitomized in the account, of course, of Marco Polo, shaped our modern imagination of what the Silk Road really is? How to uninvent or undo a 19th century Orientalist romance of the Silk Road? Of course, that's not an easy task. Supplementing written, engraved sources with images of cloth and clothing, soil and charts, vessels, walls, a 13th century cookbook, a different Silk Road all of a sudden emerges in the context of this work. And what we get to see in the work is really a landscape of cities and towns and churches, villages, roads, and the famous caravan inns that are very much at the heart of the work. I want to read you just a tiny bit of the conclusion of her book, which tells you a little bit about who Kate is. And I think it will also entice you to go home and read this book. She says, I have tried to tell a different story about the Silk Road. and about Armenia. The result has resembled the way I would tell the story to you if we were sitting together, perhaps at a small table under a tree on Sararian Street over a dwindling bottle of wine. In telling one story, I nest 5 or 6 stories together, and you will see when you have dinner with her later, that's actually what happens. And you start several more, some to be finished some other time. But my starting point has been a story about the floors, the arches, and walls of the Arai caravan inn, which I can still remember. I can remember the feel of cool, hard clay, smooth stone, the scrapes of gravel, the smear of ashy soil between my thumb. To tell the story of this caravanserai, I needed to tell you the story of the Kazakh Valley and how it was made in a world, in particular, by princely people and by people living in villages like Ambroi, and by archaeologists and historians. But to tell this story of the caravanserai, I also needed to tell you about those caravan inns in particular and medieval architecture more generally, which ultimately brought me back to the aspiration of princely people to fashion worlds in their own image, to fashion themselves as centers of the world. And along the way, I enumerate things that made up these worlds: roads, bridges, candles, prayers, stable inns, the bones of saints, ceramic pots and bowls, and a set of a welcoming table. But I also can't tell the story of those aspirant worlds without crossing their horizons with travelers like William Rubrock. And in telling their journey stories, I cross paths with other travelers of medieval and later times. As I told these stories of the Silk Road at continental scales, I found I had to start again, back up, and tell the story of how it even is that we imagine the world of medieval Eurasia as a road of silk. This messy snarl of stories is what we are going to indulge now, and it contains multiple spaces, space-times, and lots of protagonists, and some of them have no clear hero, but I think you will be telling that story for us today. So I welcome you onto the podium, Kate, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Oh my gosh. Is this on? We all right? Yes. Wow. I'm so honored to be here, and honestly, very tempted to just sit and have Melanie read my talk so I can listen to it. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for the invitation, and for the fact that I'm here, and for the fact that I've had the thoughts that I hope I've put into words to share with you all today. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation afterwards and to this evening. So I'm just going to get into this. So following on Melanie's introduction, the stories I'm going to tell today and our conversation this evening start from an energizing premise: that in the histories we write of the Middle Ages and of the lives of medieval people living in the mountains and canyons of what is now the Republic of Armenia, we may think in tangled, intersecting ways about problems of the present. Many ongoing discussions by anthropologists, by biologists, writers of science fiction, feminists, of how we might and how we must live on a damaged planet with an uncertain future hinge on imagination. In particular, social scientists across disciplines are concerned with the problem of imagining life worlds of more than human kin at timescales beyond our individual lifetimes. These challenges of dreaming an ever-widening world and also caring about and for that world, they seem hypermodern, linked to our recent discovery that we have been living in the Anthropocene this whole time. And yet, this work of imagining worlds populated by others, by folks different from us, is the central task of history and of archaeology. Meanwhile, historians of the Middle Ages have grappled with the cultural history of the idea that we have an eternal and monolithic relationship with nature, ever since Lynn White argued in 1966 that nature as we know it, as a resource to be exploited, is an idea invented by medieval people. In my recent and ongoing work, I'm curious about the effects of writing history otherwise. And in particular, I want to rewrite the story of how people make worlds for others to live in. From a narrative of control to one of care, but also with methods that care about the potential harms involved in the making of worlds. This talk is going to draw many threads from my recently published book, but I also will be thinking in the space of my ongoing project in Viodzor, focused in particular on the doings and makings of the Ilkhanid era, or Bellions. Excellent. So let me briefly lay out my theoretical toolkit. When I set to work on the archaeology of the Middle Ages, of Armenia and the Silk Road, I am intellectually situated within ongoing feminist conversations about the ethical commitment to acknowledge the cultures of our science, the fictions in our archives, and the bodies that matter in our narratives, which means thinking about the engendering inherent in ideas about geography and scale, the ways we understand the world from our bodies, and through the invocation and inscribing of the bodies of others, and of others than humans. I will briefly reference two ideas that I carry around in my pocket, polishing with frequent citation. The first is Donna Haraway's assertion, following Marilyn Strathern's arguments related to reproductive cultures, her assertion that it matters what ideas we use to think other ideas with, what stories we use to tell other stories. In a most concrete sense, this means that metaphors matter. The metaphors used to understand and describe the worlds in the Middle Ages, and the metaphors we use now to craft accounts of the past and possibilities for the future. The second tool is an argument gifted to us by the author Ursula K. Le Guin in her short 1986 essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction. This essay is nominally about fiction, but is also very much about archaeology. Le Guin asks why we are so obsessed with telling stories centered on heroes and their heroic technologies, spears, sticks, guns, and rockets. Instead, she argues we should tell stories about humans and about the containers, gourds, bottles, baskets, and woven, knitted, quilted, and crocheted textiles that humans use to carry what they cherish, care for, and love. For my purposes today, this is an argument about expanding what technologies, spaces, materials, objects, ideas, we think of as being capable of making worlds, and in the hands of what species, shapes, and kinds of makers. So I'm so grateful for the opportunity afforded me by the Center for Armenian Studies, invitation to participate in these ongoing conversations on Armenian ecologies, and of course for the Noroyan granted endowed lecture, which I am so overwhelmed and honored to be the first lecturer of. I appreciate the challenge to write my medieval history ecologically. But what does it mean to write history ecologically? For myself, it is to extend the capacities of historical agency, of the capacities for change, for the creation and sustaining of conditions of historical possibility to agencies beyond narrowly bounded human beings. In recent reflections on more than human worlds in conversations related to the distributed contingencies of the Anthropocene, scholar Scott Gilbert holds up the biological multi-entity of the holobiont, arguing that humans are themselves multi-organismal, from the microbiomes of our guts to the microbes that affect our genetic expressions. This ongoing conversation in biology reverberates an old medieval idea rooted in humoralism and Aristotelian philosophy that human beings do not stand apart from the meteorological, elemental, and biotic worlds around them, but rather that human bodies, emotions, and dispositions are estuaries in wider seas. Through this talk, I will refer back to this idea repeatedly, oriented through two anthropological concepts. The first of these is natureculture, a concept developed by Donna Haraway and others and used by anthropologists and political ecologists to reiterate that there is no such thing as a natural environment separate from its cultural perceptions, constructions, and interventions of human beings. That the idea of wild nature even is fundamentally cultural and must be historicized. We have to think about the ways that we have invented the idea of nature. The second concept is space-time, an argument from both literary criticism and anthropology, which asserts that our narratives of event, agency, and history take place in space, that stories make their own worlds, and that thus attunements to space and place can reconfigure our understandings of time and its effects. So as I discuss in Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, to think in terms of spacetimes enables historians and archaeologists to understand material and narrative practices in the past, the making and using of things and the writings of histories themselves, to understand them as technologies of world making. So the thread running through the next few minutes will be a focus on the power of telling new stories in the medieval past, but also in history, in archaeology, in science, the power of telling new stories to generate new worlds. But now let's go to the Middle Ages and to the particular time and place of the Armenian highlands in the 13th and 14th centuries. My work on place and world making in Armenia spans a complicated period, punctuated by the Mongol invasions of the 1230s. It could be said that this is a perverse place to start a story, given that Armenian historian Kyriakos Ganjiketsi begins his account of these years paradoxically by writing, "This is the end of time." Let's lean into that paradox. For of course, the Mongol conquest of the Caucasus and the consolidation of Mongol governance in the Eastern Mediterranean, Iran, and Central Asia was really a beginning. And the histories of this period testify to the struggle to make sense of a world on a new timeline. The historian Roxanne Prasniak said it better than I ever could in 2019. Of the long Mongol 13th century, she wrote, "In the end, events would prompt a large-scale rethinking about human agency in history itself. During this period, every group, including the Mongols, needed a new story that would relocate themselves in the web of relations that constituted a new cultural and political whole." This was the defining project of the 13th century set in motion by the Mongol conquests, end quote. As I discuss in Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, this defining project is visible in the political projects of Armenian princely families, working to configure their social world in the wake of the Georgian Bagratid conquest of the Highland valleys during the so-called Zakared Period, named for the Armenian Georgian generals Ivane and Zakare Zakarian, who rallied the Armenian princes against the Seljuks. My focus in the book is on the Vachutian princes, and in particular Vache Vachutian, his wife Mama Khatun, and their son Kurd and his wife Khoresha. In Aragat Sotin, it is possible to see early evidence of the labor of post-Mongol reworlding within the built environment in the epigraphic record of the Vachutian endowments of Hovanavank and Samosavank, both of which overlook the Kasak River north of Yerevan. The core of these monasteries were reconstructions and elaborations of early medieval chapels associated with Gregory the Illuminator into grand churches by Vache and Mama Khatun in the 1220s under the patronage of the Zakarians, as is attested by their donation inscriptions. But in the 1250s, repairs and additions were made by their son Kurd and his wife Khoresha. And Kurd and Khoresha recorded their renovations and donations to Samosavank and Hovanavank, adding their names to the walls inscribed by Kurd's parents. Their matching inscriptions, dated 1250 and 1255, give us a glimpse of the ways the Vachutians worked to house the world of the Kasak Valley within a world that had been knocked about its axis by the Mongol invasions. In their preambles, the inscriptions relate how, having proved themselves worthy of their new rulers, Kurd and Khoresha set about rebuilding sections of the churches built by their parents, which had been ruined during the conquest. Interestingly, the inscriptions invoke these new rulers not by name, as will happen later, as we shall see, or as Mongols, but as the foreign-born army of archers, a term that is, by this point, famous and associated with visions of the apocalypse. Their inscription at Samosavank commemorates the new space to their sons and daughter and extended the fame of their built world into the future that these children embodied. This shows the practical narrative work of mending political cosmologies so as to stretch beyond the invasion that their contemporary historian Kyriakos Ganjiketsi described as history's end. So I'll just say a word here. I mean, Melanie said so many good words already, to promote Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, which explores the world makings of the Vachutians in the Kasak Valley, east of Aragats, in detail and at multiple scales. Specifically, I focus within the space of the Caravan Inn, or the Karavanatun, a space of cosmopolitan world-making within which the Vachutians and their contemporaries meshed their own family destinies within the larger world-scale fabric of the high medieval Silk Road. The book, which you can all read at your leisure, builds on the work of the Vachutians to argue that cosmopolitan politics in high medieval Armenia was a matter of care, concerned with hospitality towards and care for Silk Road travelers, or as their contemporaries, the Bellions, called them, the strangers, others, and needy who traveled the roads. The end result for me was a pushback against models of globalization as an impact of the global on the local, and rather a vision of medieval Armenian politics as permeable to, as well as constructive of, the global world of the Silk Road. But today, I'm going to greedily take advantage of your hospitality to discuss new work situated a few days' journey to the south in Viodzor, which in the 13th and 14th centuries was a powerful part of the larger medieval region of Syunik. I have been working in Viodzor with my co-PI and dear friend Ostrik Babajanian since 2015. Our project is interested in Viodzor as a medieval landscape of towns, villages, roads, fortresses, caravanserais, and bridges, and as a world constructed through the projects of the Armenian or Bellion princes, who administered the region with privileged inju status granted by the Mongols. Our archaeological project combines regional survey and excavations with epigraphy and research into the textual narrative construction of Viodzor as a place. So I'm going to focus on one of our primary medieval interlocutors, Stepanos or Bellion, the metropolitan bishop of Syunik, who completed his Papnichun Nahangin Sisakan, or the history of the state of Sisakan, shortly before his death in 1305. Stepanos is a powerful figure in the medieval Armenian church, as well as being the close relative of the ruling Orbelians. He is son to Tarsaic Orbelian, favored vassal to the Mongols, and a major patron of Tatev and Noravank, as well as various other monasteries and projects. The text of the history is an intriguing example of the spatiotemporal layering which makes up the landscapes we study in Viodzor. Stepanos' history, like that of many medieval historians, is cosmographic. It's the writing of a new universe. And in his introduction, he very humbly compares himself to God, compelled by divine nature to create, to bring worlds into being. And he is doing this in the writing of his historical world. And a fascinating aspect of Orbelion's literary Viodzor is that the physical world is an agentive nature culture. It's shaped by the doings of Armenian men and women, and itself acts, shapes, interacts. Orbelion's history provokes me to think ecologically about the history of Viodzor, attentive to the ways that the physical landscape informs medieval politics, memory, and historical narrative, as well as how the history Orbelion writes enlists the physical landscape as a collaborator in historical event and princely endeavors. And I'm going to draw on Robert Bedrosian's translations, but I think sometimes I list the pagination also for the 1859 Garapar edition where relevant. You can all follow along. So as an illustration, let me introduce Viodzor as a space within deep time. If you've been there or seen pictures, you will have been struck by the cacophony of Viodzor's geology. The region is highly seismic and has been for millennia. The hills upon which sites like Gladzor University were built are striped with the lines of geological strata upended like flipped tables. If you look up from the canyon roads, you are struck by the honeycombed colonnades of basalt, geological formations formed when hot volcanic lava poured into the cold waters of an ancient sea. The ancient sands of that sea form the famous caves of Viodzor, such as Arani Bird Cave, and the fossilized bodies of sea creatures frequently emerge from the rocks. And you can see shark's teeth, coral, and ammonites on display at the Zakared Regional Museum, which you can see here. For Stepanos or Bellion, the history of Viodzor begins with the origin of its name. In particular, the Vi of Viodzor, which he identifies as a cry of pain, of lament. In his explanation, he recounts a story wherein the ascetic Saint Stepanos, torch of the house of Torgon, is murdered through the evil of a lustful woman. The divine retribution for the killing of this saint is a terrible earthquake. Quote, "The earth was roiled like the sea from waves which began in the deep and rose up, and it was demolished as though by waves in the sea." There are many fascinating things about this. For instance, the demonstration of Viodzor as a moral landscape, a technology of divine judgment shaped by the moral ecologies of human beings. But also, I want to take Orbelion's choice of metaphor seriously. There is an unruly oceanic space in the time of Viodzor's early history, which parallels the fossilized evidence, which would have been as remarkable to people in the 14th century as it is today. However, this is not the end of the story. Stepanos recounts the fate of the woman for whom, quote, "Repentance came too late. She stripped off her clothes and with rocks tore her breasts, which flowed with a stream of blood," end quote. The repenting woman buries herself in a ditch across the valley from Tanahat and laments until the voice of the saint calls out forgiveness, but it is too late and she dies in her rocky pit. Now, according to Stepanos or Bellion, it is the cries of the people buried by the stone waves of the earthquake that give Viodzor its name. However, I am struck by the singular image of the lamenting woman whose cries echo in the canyon even as the red rocks of the young landscape are nursed by her bleeding breast. This account of Viodzor's making is an example of complex nature culture, a place made from hybrid geologies, phantom seas, and human flesh. The Viodzor of the history is also a tangled space-time and a textual palimpsest of erasures as well as makings. The text is a critical resource for archaeologists in the ways that it corresponds with the built and inscribed landscape recorded in our surveys and in the Divan Haivi Magruchian, the corpus of Armenian inscriptions, as well as in the ongoing work of epigraphers. Bellion frequently describes both the building of a site, a monastery, a church, as well as providing a transcription of the founding inscription. And in some cases, Bellion relates that he has only partially transcribed an inscription which is already eroded or deteriorated. But in this complex correlation, the history challenges us to interweave the narrative space-times of the history itself, the text, with the emplaced texts of architectural inscriptions and the places which are also invoked and made as political assemblance within those inscriptions. It's complicated, but I'll explain. So we have a layering of the description of the relating of inscriptions by Stepanos or Bellion. We have the inscriptions themselves, and then we have the spaces that are enumerated in those texts themselves carved on walls. Ostrich and I are currently working, Ostrich and I are currently working to join the networks of physical places recorded on our surveys within the parallel intersecting network of places named in the dedicatory inscriptions scattered throughout the tributary valleys of the Arpa River system. I'll just briefly summarize how the inscriptions work. They record the donations of a princely man or woman, whether the founding of a monastery, the building of a church, or the subsequent donation of buildings, funds, precious objects like reliquaries, or ritual paraphernalia or vestments to extant foundations. In many cases in Viodzor, the list of gifts includes gifts of earth and water, chovyevju, enumerated as the flows of streams and the gardens in named villages, which those gifted waters will make bloom. As I discuss in Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, and as Nick Matthew has recently explored in splendid detail for the epigraphy of Ani, these inscriptions record the redistribution of human labors as well as the seasonal space-times of agricultural and pastoral produce. But today I want to think about these as an indication of an ecological attunement within the politics of the Orbelians and their kin, contemporaries, and vassals. In doing so, I'm also building off of a central argument from the book, my book, which is that according to medieval cosmology, the assembled worlds enumerated within these donor inscriptions were thought to be co-identical with the bodies of the donor, slotting into a worldview where bodies, churches, and political landscapes were nested models of an orderly Christian universe. So why is it interesting that the princes of Viodzor, as well as their real and fictive kin in Orbelion's history, emphasized earth and water as chief among their gifts, as the flesh of their assembled princely selves? In trying to work through this question, I've been thinking a lot with observations made by Scott Redford, in particular the idea of the just landscape and the garden of the state in the Iranian and Anatolian Seljuk context. As is demonstrated in Mirrors for Princes or royal advice literature from this period, the good prince was fundamentally concerned with the making of a just landscape, defined as not only orderly and well organized with bridges, roads, and caravanserais, but also fertile and verdant. The Ilkhanid vizier Rashid al-Din Hamadani was concerned with greening in ways that overlapped with pious donation and infrastructural immortality, as well as with increasing the productivity of the Ilkhanate in the landscapes around Tabriz. And like the Seljuks, the Mongols were, of course, a mobile court, and so the rhythms of politics in this period followed seasonal transformations in the affordances of the landscape. So as Redford argued, the mobility of the court was not, contrary to Western misrecognition, perceived as a weakness, but as a demonstration of the unity of the ruler with a seasonal calendar. The prince didn't travel as dictated by the seasons. He made and brought the seasons. And so reflecting on these broad-scale medieval trends and thinking about what we casually call the natural world has strengthened my resolve to pay more attention to the construction and donation of farms, gardens, orchards, forests, and waters within the epigraphic and historical record, as well as to think in infrastructural and political ways about the verdant landscapes we can recover archaeologically in Viodzor. The Orbelians and other rulers of this region cared about landscape, and the identity of green fertility with the cosmogenic nature of the ruler influences the metaphorical language used to write about the just rule of the Orbelians. So in his description of his kin and their children, Stepanos Orbelian describes his uncle Ivane and the children of Elikum, Bukta and Bortel, as blossoming and flower lovely. And so there is a scalar nesting of the bodies of these flower princes with the green worlds that they built in Viodzor, which are in turn enmeshed in the shared greenscapes of Central Asian politics. The gifting of earth and water is frequently described in Orbelian's history. And again, an attention to Orbelian's metaphors corroborates my sense that in the High Middle Ages, Armenians, like himself, saw an ecological continuity in the beautiful power of just princes and the powerful beauty of green and watered landscape. I'll give it as an example Orbelian's account of the founding of Hermon Monastery, which is located on the slopes above the Yekagas River in a location that in Orbelian's time would have overlooked the sprawl of the princely seat of Yekagas and its suburb of Hostun. The gardens of Hermon Ivank, the monastery of Hermon, were dedicated by Sophia, the wife of Prince Simbat of Syunik, in the 10th century. Orbelian describes the purchase of farms, gardens, and vineyards by Sophia and her donations to the church in perpetuity. As he says, I'm not quite there yet. As he says, Lady Sophia purchased the village of Hawu and its borders, which was opposite the monastery, and she gave it as inheritance to the church along with other vineyards and gardens in Yehegik. She also adorned the church with many utensils and enriched it with all kinds of useful things. With great anathemas, she confirmed Hawu village as the church's property so that no one would try to separate it from the church. As a memorial to themselves, they stipulated that the Feast of St. Gregory be celebrated and that 40 masses be celebrated. So you understand like the donation of the gardens in perpetuity. And you can actually see in the background of this image the terraces going up the hill behind Hermon. Sophia likewise has a dedication inscription on the western wall of Gundevank Monastery in eastern Viodzor, higher up in the flow of the Arpa south of Jermuk. According to Stepanos Orbelian, Sophia was moved to build a monastery on the site of a martyrion after the martyrs themselves appeared to her in a dream. And you can see the partial inscription, which is on the church, reads, I, Sophia, Lady of Syunik, daughter of Deren, wife of Simbat, son of Ashod, Prince of Syunik, built this my church. So we have the physical inscription on the building, which then correlates in interesting ways to the inscription that Stepanos Orbelian himself records, which is non-extant, which reads, I, Lady Sophia, wife of the God-preserved Lord Simbat of Syunik and daughter of Grigor Derenek, built this church in memory of my soul and for the longevity of the Prince of Princes Simbat and our children. I adorned the church with costly vessels and gave 2 villages to it as a legacy. Let no one dare to obstruct or alienate them, etc. And as she concludes, formerly, Viodzor was a ring without a stone. I made this church and placed a jewel on that ring. The stony landscape of Viodzor is therefore embodied indexically as an ornament on the body of the world. Orbelian confirms the gifts of Sophia to Gundevank, describing how she built and donated villages and how, quote, up and down the valley as far as Golosht Rock, she had densely planted with fruit-bearing trees and marvelous, beautiful vineyards, yielding delicious produce. This abundance was for the enjoyment of the holy brethren and all those in need, end quote. I love this as an example of medieval nature culture and the parallel here in the making of a hospitable earth for those in need, Amen 9 Karatolots, to the construction of a hospitable world of the caravanserai I described earlier and is described in my book. Both the founding of institutions and making the landscape green and fruitful are the work of making worlds for others to live in, undertaken by an earthy, watery, blossom-lovely princely power which wears the red stones of Viodzors like coral set in a ring. I want to shift a little bit and think the configuration of self-world making discussed in the context of the practice of endowing buildings and building selves and building worlds, but from another direction. Specifically, I want to think briefly about medieval silken textiles, about the clothing of bodies and the making of political worlds, and this again shifting to think about the other technologies of world making as provoked by Le Guin. So first, let me discuss a bit the importance of silk and of silken robes in particular to medieval politics and particularly within the Silk Road world of the Mongol ecumen. The role of robes of honor has been extensively discussed with Lynn Jones, Anthony Eastman, and others focusing specifically on the importance of robes and investiture, or the ceremony of robing, to the inscribing of Bagratid Armenia within the spheres of Byzantine and Abbasid power. Several scholars, myself included, have drawn links between the clothing of powerful bodies and the draping of churches, the investment of space. I especially love Patricia Blessing's 2018 discussion of the traces of draperies in the buildings of Ani, from textile motifs in wall art to conjecture on the embroidered or lacework shadows cast by a metalwork chandelier recovered by the Mar excavations. And as multiple scholars have argued, we can see the importance of textiles in constructing political identities in Armenia, in the way that clothing is used in donor portraits, in architectural donations, such as these images of the Proshans, vassals of the Orbelian princes of Syunik. You can see here the way that Eachi and Hasan Proshan represented themselves in their donations. On the left is a reliquary of the True Cross associated with Hotokarat's monastery, which is south and west of Noravank. And on the right are architectural donor portraits taken from the monastery of Spitakavor, north of Yehernadzor. Both portraits make use of the cross-breasted Mongol deal, a silk robe. In the Spitakavor portraits in particular, we see Proshans and in the Central Asian, in the role of the Central Asian ruler as hunter, holding bows and posed in mid-Parthian shot, that incredible backwards hunting technique. These images provide a shorthand for the tactics of Armenians telling their own new stories of the Mongol era, the significance of which is deepened if we re-embed these objects back into the walls and altars of monastic sites and into the landscape of Viodzor from which they were taken. As the historian Thomas Olson explored in depth, the wearing as well as the arrangement and exchange of silk garments was of critical significance within Mongol politics. This signals how situated the Mongol court was within traditions of Eurasian prestatory politics dating to the Sasanian period and the Roman era, and it also demonstrates the integration of Mongol tastes within the networks of commodity exchange which united the medieval world. The most public and politically weighted use of silk was in the practice of investiture, by which a supreme ruler would mark their subordinates, vassals, honored guests, dependents, delegates, and fictive kin by dressing them in silken robes. In the most marked case, these robes would be ritually removed from the body of the king before being draped on their subject. Practices that tied this world together were motivated by the understanding that beautiful and powerful bodies were to be draped in silk, whether the bodies of princes or the cosmologically complex bodies of churches, manuscripts, and relics. All of these silk-dressed bodies circulated through the medieval world as a medium for the more ephemeral mobility of images and cultural dispositions. So instances of Mongol investiture thus give us a glimpse at the machinery by which the culture of the 13th century was tied together. We see delegates and monarchs traveling to the Mongol courts to be transformed into new political subjects through the gift of silk. The case of the Cilician king Hetem is perhaps the best known, but the history of Syunik gives us further glimpses of at this material political culture and suggests the close relationship of the Christian princes of Syunik with their Mongol sovereign rulers ruling from Tabriz. So we have the description, for instance, of the investiture of Tarsaic, or Bellion, Stephanos' father, by Abaka Khan in presented in the history, as he says, now after him, his brother Tarsaic ruled over all this realm. He was honored and loved by the rulers and all the grandees, and thus did he rule over his principality with lofty and magnificent glory. Again, a just prince. So honored was he by Abaka Khan that on many occasions the latter removed his own royal garments and dressed Tarsaic in them from head to toe, and put around Tarsaic's waist a belt of pure gold adorned with precious stones and pearls. You can see the invocation then of the belt you can also see in these images as well as part of that investiture. Stepanos or Bellion himself traveled in the late 1280s to the order of the world-ruling king Aryun Khan in the Maraga plain of northern Iran, which under the Ilkhanids was the summer pasture of the court at Tabriz. And you have the description here of the investment of Stepanos. As he describes, Aryun commanded us to remain and to bless a portable church at the royal court, which had been sent by the Pope of Rome. Also present there was the Nestorian Catholicos with 12 bishops, etc., etc. Aryun with his own hands dressed us in the patriarchal vestments which he himself had designated for the Catholicos, ourselves, and all the bishops. And you can see two things here, both, again, the dressing of the powerful body of the bishop, and also I love the reference to this portable church, which again is a church entirely made of textiles. This investiture by Aryan parallels and complements the investiture of Stepanos by Levin III a few pages earlier in the history, and demonstrates the multiple worlds of Armenian, Christian, and Mongol power straddled by the Orbelians. So understanding the importance of silk robes and the practice of robing helps us to see the profound significance of this event in the history of Armenian relationships with the Mongols. And thinking about silk and practices of robing also give us hints at the role of textiles in social life in Viodzor, which we must infer from texts and artistic depictions since textiles do not survive in the archaeological record. But primarily for me, and this comes back to the question of technologies of world making, it raises a question of material and technological agency in this ecology of beauty and power. Who makes the silk that makes the world? This summer, I did a lot of thinking about textiles and their role in politics during breaks in our work at the Viodzor Regional Museum, where I would stand in front of the Astounda Khachkar from Noravank, attributed to the master artisan Momik, part of the community of artistic production, which was housed in the monastic landscape of Viodzor. This genre of Khachkar is frequently called aser akord zakan, needlework or embroidered. And while I don't want to get into the history of Khachkars as objects in landscape, that's a whole other series of books, I do want to use this one as a point of connection by reflecting, following art historians like Eva Hoffman, that the textility of the Khachkar could be a deliberate evocation of hanging textiles, such as the hangings woven to clothe the bodies of churches, as mentioned above, which led me in turn back to the archeological invisibility of textiles as central to the webs of medieval politics in Armenia, and finally to the likewise occluded makers of these world-making works. One thing we learn from medieval histories is that elite textiles such as those hung in churches were woven by elite women, which is in turn commensurate with textile culture elsewhere along the Silk Road. I'll quickly refer to a popular citation from Kyriakos Ganjaketsi discussing the furnishing of Norgetik or Goshavank in 1214 by Arzu Khatun, the wife of Vakhtang Kataketsi, Prince of Khachen and patron of the construction along with his brothers. Kyriakos Ganjaketsi described the donation of textiles by Arzu Khatun, who he also credited with weaving textiles for Makaravank, Khakpad, and Darivank, her own endowments. As he says, quote, "She and her daughters made a beautiful curtain of the softest goat's hair as a covering for the holy altar, a marvel to behold. It was dyed with variegated colors like a piece of carving with pictures accurately drawn on it showing the incarnation of the Savior and other saints. It astonished those who saw it. Beholders would bless God for giving women the knowledge of tapestry making and the genius of embroidery." So this is still a little bit entangled in my head, but I'm intrigued by the ways that textile donations are a woman's work that also becomes a prince's work in Armenia, with a result that the durable evidence we have for otherwise invisible textiles is in the architecture and monuments alongside which they made up a complete, beautiful, and powerful world. So of course, we know that Arzu Khatun also constructed buildings as well as draping them in textiles. Her famous inscription at Darivank establishes her as a donor in her own right and shows how her woven worlds were in turn entwined within or draped over the bodies of broader political spacetimes. This example in particular introduces more agents into the makings of worlds: mothers and daughters, vegetable dyes, goats, and goat herds. Just as both princely men and women in the Mongol world could invest their clients with silken robes of honor, both men and women donated textiles. Stephanos or Bellion describes how his father, Tarsaich, adorns Tatev in beautiful garments. In ways that I'm still thinking about, these entangled practices complicate medieval gender in ways that can only be better understood with reference to the ecologically complex ways that practices, bodies, landscapes, spaces, and selves constructed one another. So, rocks and ancient seas, earth and water, bones, blood and silk, churches and gardens, saints and sinners, priests and princes, earth tillers, weavers, embroiderers, and builders, and goats. Already this story of medieval Viodzor has a motley cast of primary characters. In this brief discussion, I have tried to think ecologically about the space-time of medieval Viodzor as knit from all the doings and beings of all these characters, as well as through the authorship of Orbelians and their kin, and of course through the empowered authorship of Stepanos or Bellion himself. But as we have seen, the natural landscape of Viodzor intrudes in this cultural telling. just as cultural ideas about the links between the green and the good inform the decisions to break new ground, to clothe the rocky flanks of the canyons in a tapestry of vines and fruiting trees. But I want to pause, because all of this talk of gardens is starting to sound Edenic. In positing that medieval people in Viodzor and its surrounds thought in natural cultural ways about power and place, I don't want to fall into the old trap of holding up the Middle Ages as a time of harmony between humans and the natural world, an innocent childhood before the industrial fall from grace. It's not just that medieval people were robustly capable of destructively exploiting their environments, because they were, or that these assemblages did not constitute a politics of authority, knowledge, and domination, for we can see that they can and they did. Rather, I care about this history of Viodzor as a more than human place, in the ways that it demonstrates that places are made in the storytelling, and that our ways of telling are instrumental in our biopolitical ways of seeing and knowing the natural cultural places we make, whether as historians or anthropologists or scientists of any stripe. So thinking about the Middle Ages provokes us to be attentive to the worlds we use to make other worlds, whether the schismatic multi-worlds of the Anthropocene or even the future stories of smaller places. So for instance, the vision of a verdant medieval Viodzor is one of several potentially conflicting ideas for the future of that landscape. The highways through Viodzor serve simultaneously as future corridors for multiple projects. The southern branch of a new transit highway as an archaeological heritage corridor, and as the trunk road of the linked Viodzor wine route. As protests around projects like the Almosar gold mine have shown, a small war is being waged over different visions of a just landscape, with capacities to bring prosperity to different populations, and with different ethical questions oriented around the proper subjects under the state's care. Is it the wild nature of snow leopards and bezoar goats, or the productive natural resources of minerals, metals, and hydroelectricity? Or is it the agrotourism route, within which a particular historical nature culture involving old vines and medieval viticultural tradition is elevated as the authentic way to live in these landscapes? Navigating these intersecting, conflicting possible worlds is part of the long-term aims of our work in Viodzor, and is something that I'm going to continue to be thinking about for a while. Central to this is thinking about the stories used to tell the story of medieval Viodzor and medieval Armenia, and the stories these medieval stories make possible or difficult to tell. Which worlds we might need to world otherwise. So for many of these reflections, I'm indebted to my brilliant friend Ani Honarchian. So to return to the Orbellian's origin story for Viodzor, it matters, I think, that the nature culture of this place is violent, involving the murder of a saint who was hacked from the branches of a tree where he had been sleeping, and the nursing of the soil by a tortured woman's heart blood. As historians shift our perspective on the Anthropocene away from a reductive narrative of the exploitation of nature by humans and towards a more complex story where the idea of wild nature is produced in tandem with human exploitation and suffering, it's worth reasserting that in dreaming of the Middle Ages as an era of harmony, we might be getting back to the wrong nature, as Bill Cronin put it. And there is also another feminist point to be made here. Thinking about making worlds means that we have to think about makers, and about the making of communities as a process which is ongoing and situated in practice rather than rooted eternally in soil. In my book and in our ongoing work, I try to cast light on new kinds of people as the makers of worlds, not just princes, princely historians, and Mongol world rulers, but also the weavers of textiles and carvers of stones, throwers of pots and stirrers of stews. I have also worked to reground cosmopolitanism in the everyday, in local doings. But also this means that we have to continually be aware of the ways that narrow nationalisms territorialize world projects in bodies that allied too easily with home, that are too vulnerable to being buried at heart depth in claims to soil. The scalar nested in non-hierarchical ways that medieval Armenians constructed identities in networked ways often jar with anachronistic linear ideas about national subjectivity. So in reading a recent article by Ali Mozaffari and James Barry on the way that carpet weaving has been territorialized in the ongoing conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I recalled the use of Ganjaketsi's description of Arzu Khatun's textile donation by art historians to stake a claim to the superlative antiquity of Armenian carpet weaving in Karabakh. I do not dispute the facts of this history, but rather I raise the question of whether Arzu and her weaving might move us beyond flat symbols to tell a richer story. How worlds are made one stitch at a time by parents and children every day and in the company of others. So I'm sure my time is running out, and I want to make sure we have some time to talk. I hope I've opened a little space to think about writing the stories required to live in new worlds, whether the world after the end of the world of the Mongol era in Armenia, or for our own uncertain, damaged world. I'm finding increasingly that my praxis as a person in the world is shaped by my practice as a historian, or perhaps those go in both directions. What I mean is that I find that as I work to imagine the natural cultural world of Viodzor and all of the humans, not heroes, that lived in that place, and as I work in turn to care for that little more than human medieval world, I'm finding that I grow better at caring about other far-off worlds, including the strangers and others who populate the future. And I sympathize with medieval Armenians, whether Kurd and Horashah donating to churches in their children's name in Aragat Sotin, or Cesar or Bellion's son endowing the caravanserai in the Selim Pass, even as the Mongol Ilkhanate faltered. I sympathize with them for holding tight to the idea of a knowable future, even in a time of rapid change. So I'm trying to be aware of the fragility of my own made worlds, like this story that I'm now finishing telling, almost, and I'm increasingly grateful for the worlds of others. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you.
Thank you, Kate. Would you field your own question on the floor, and then I will
Yes.
monitor the chat or the Q&A on the online forum. And if you have a question, you will have to speak into the microphone, because otherwise the people online will not be able to hear us. So we'll go from there.
Does anyone have a question? Or have I stunned you into silence?
Thank you for a brilliant and really fascinating lecture. I have a shaggy question, maybe.
Ooh, okay.
My question is, do you see, so I was really fascinated by the idea of, local elites and everyday people making a local nature culture that also kind of interfaces with broader nature culture ideas. Do you see any counter nature culture, like an attempt to write a story that reinvents the landscape from another place? Are there competing nature culture ecosystems that,
like a plurality or a multivocality? I mean, sorry, I'll let you finish your question before I
No,
answer
that's
the
it
question.
basically. Yeah, I was just curious, is there competition in this landscape or room for it?
I think absolutely. And so again, I have to thank you all for your indulgence in listening to this, because so much of this is ideas that I'm trying to use to orient future research. And I think one of the primary, the plurality of this and the, again, multivocality of this world is something that is definitely I think the challenge that arises for us as historians, because while I feel like so much of the task is to try to make differences commensurate in such a way that we can tell the stories of people simultaneously, but at the same time, I'm always fighting against the temptation to kind of, not the temptation, the tendency to kind of let differences dissolve, which is again part of so much of the challenge of thinking about cosmopolitanism. To answer your question, I think absolutely. So for instance, what I find so interesting about, so for going back to Arzu Khatun and her goat hair weaving, is the way that the labor of pastoralists is recruited into that project in ways that I'm sure elide the tension between all of this garden making and reclamation of hillsides and creating and building of terraces, the tension between that and the the mobility of pastoralists, right? And so already there's that's a tension that obviously is much discussed in the Middle Ages and is kind of at heart of the identity crisis of the Mongol century of are we nomads or are we settled agrarian people? And so I think that's, I'm anticipating and I'm going to try to keep that tension productive. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's just one of them, right? Yes.
Fantastic lecture, really.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I don't know much about medieval Armenian, but I was a student once for 2 years of Nina Garsoyan. And she talked—
So jealous.
And she's still with us, by the way. And so she she said at one point that Armenian kings basically didn't have a capital. They moved from place to place wherever the king was, and you sort of alluded to that. And I was thinking about this mobility thing, right? So landscapes could be stable, they could be fixed, or they could be mobile. And as you just indicated, there's some kind of tension or difference, certainly, between these people who are sweeping across Eurasia and people who are building buildings like that, which are meant to stand for thousands of years and actually have. So there's some people are building things that possess the landscape, or that at least say this is ours, and others have tents and move from place to place. I mean, it seems to me that's a very rich area to sort of explore. And I wonder, is there any question here, or is there a way, are there any sources that can talk about the legitimacy of whose land this is? Or maybe that wasn't even a question. That is, this is Hayot's, Yakir, or whatever. And so at least Armenians might be making a claim by building those very solid buildings.
So yes, that is an old question in, I mean, sorry. I mean like in history, in medieval history. I mean, and I'm thinking about, in like Ibn Khaldun writing in the, in the Middle Ages about like this tension between like, how do we, like, I've got like archaeologists of nomadism in the audience. Like, how do we think about like the greatness of civilizations? Is it the durability of their built buildings, or is it the richness of their traditions, or whatever? Like how do we think about this? And I think on the one hand, and it's also like a fascinating and really challenging question for archaeologists to think about, like how do you impact a landscape? And certainly in Eurasia and into the Caucasus, like this is such a point of an ongoing point of debate among archaeologists and anthropologists of like thinking about different ways of perceiving and kind of dreaming these places. And the struggle to kind of get outside of our perceptions of what is a natural landscape that is juxtaposed with a cultural monument, as opposed to like the ways that nomadic pastoralists, for instance, would see deep memory in these spaces as they're punctuated with burial mounds and and not just like the storytelling that's attached to mountains and water sources and all of these things. And of course, like that is also, you see that also in the histories and things that we have recorded, as well as the oral tradition. So Bellion's history itself is a way of rooting stories about people and their histories in place, to springs, to rocks and cliffs, and so that you can imagine, that his documentary history, that's the manuscript itself being paralleled in a kind of mobile storytelling. This is a very long-winded question, like answer to another shaggy question, but I think so. For me, the challenge is again like trying to keep that kind of cacophony in the foreground, and think about the ways that like these techniques of like thinking about place would have cross-pollinated. And certainly, I mean, again, like that example I had of, so here is Stepanos or Bellion, and the Orbellian princes who are versed in all of the ways of all these techniques of eternity, of architecture, and getting someone to write your dynastic history, but also like he is also like blessing and consecrating ephemeral architecture, right? Things that moved around and kind of underscored that idea that like a church could be anywhere you put the tent poles on the ground, right? That you could consecrate and transform any ground. So I think that complexity is, I mean, again, it's hard to write. It's hard to write a story that is so many stories at the same time. And so yeah. So thank you.
There's a wonderful thing you just said, that there are different ways to appropriate the land and to think of things and so forth. But there's a modern sensibility. So I'll give you an example. A young Kurd and a young Armenian are traveling around eastern Anatolia in the Van province. There are about 200 monuments, Armenian monuments, in that Van province. And the Kurd asked this young Armenian, where are our buildings? They don't exist, right? And so there's a way in modern times that we have monuments, and think about the destruction of monuments, wiping out built environments, or appropriating them and making them into barns or whatever, and also the literary tradition. So you have a kind of modern legitimation because we had a literary tradition. We had buildings, and you didn't. You know? So
Absolutely,
But it's
yeah.
interesting that you're preserving what would be a different sensibility and a different understanding from that time.
I would like to think so. I mean, what I think is interesting is that, yeah, like so for instance, again, like the history of the state of Sisakan, like is such a familiar modern project of universal history, which is of course also a very ancient project of universal history. But in it, it reveals these techniques of, again, of using the landscape as a mnemonic, as that demonstrate that like the telling of that history is inseparable from the place that it is rooted in, right? The places that make the memories. Yeah, thank you for making me think about that more. Sorry, I'm supposed to be mediating my own. Should I take? Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. I will also plug your work and Ani's review of David Zakarian's book in the Journal of the Society for Armenian Studies that's coming up. So, thank you.
Thank you.
I've been really invested in the idea of futurism and Armenian futurism. So you could take this question as far as you want, or
Wow, it's so
not
exciting.
as far as you want. But thinking about nature, culture, and space-time, and the idea of landscape and monument. I've been thinking also a lot about the pre-modern world as kind of building on what Michael and Ron were just asking. Have you thought about these historiographies and reading them through the lens of world building as a type of a futurist kind of endeavor? And could you say a little more about that?
Yes, thank you. Okay, wait, I have to like back up to make sure I give this question credit. So again, like thinking science fictionally or speculatively about medieval history, I mean, I think like there's such a kinship, and this is something that I've been trying to build into as I have shifted gears from my project in Argeology to my project in Viodzor, thinking about like trying to build in from the ground up in this project of that first of all, like and I've thought about this a lot for years now, like as I have tried to teach anthropology and science fiction in like the same class, which was a fun challenge. Is that that there is a parallel project in like in the writing of a speculative account of a future world, and like these projects that are inherently concerned with like a time after ourselves, like a time after our own lifetime. And so, I mean, obviously, like, I mean, the Armenian princes and princely families who from the 6th and 7th century into the up until the 18th, 19th century are and now we're still, I mean, we're like endowing future practices like in their own name. Like that is a speculative fiction of a kind. Like that is an attempt to set a world in motion that's going to keep running after you're gone. And what is I find like so moving about a lot of these on the face of them like quite dry formulaic architectural inscriptions is that they do demonstrate like that hope and that I mean it's also a very proud, quite egotistical hope that that this world is going to keep ticking after you're gone, and but because it is a part of you, you are giving of yourself, of your own body and being and fashioned self, that like you are going to continue, that there is a immortality in the continued functioning of a world, whether it's priests continuing to say mass in your memory and by saying your name into the air, and or whether it's just knowing that this building, I think that coming back to this previous question, like, it's more complicated than like this building is going to stand forever. What I think is so interesting about whether it's Tigran Honens's inscription at Ani, which is so famous, or the inscription inside the Selim caravanserai, which is like if you go in this doorway and it's right on the right hand side, this is like the idea that people are going to continue traveling and entering this building, and they will be fed and housed and kept warm in long after Cesar or Bellion himself is dead, and his wife and his brothers and like the other people who are named. And so like that's absolutely a kind of science fiction that that you can imagine the future and it can be as utopian or dystopian as you want it to be. And so I like, in terms of like therefore, but what I think again, so I've been trying, I'm trying to like set aside some time to spend more time with Stepanos or Bellion and his history, which I do want to think of as a kind of like, to call it science fiction is like that's like not crass, but that's not giving him enough credit for what he's doing. But the idea that it's like this is a speculative world that has both a past and a future, and that yeah. So thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. So it's like yes, absolutely, all the time. I think that all the time. Yes, thank you. And I'd love to talk about that more.
Okay, I want to quickly jump in with a question from our online audience, if I may.
Please.
Yes? Okay, so this question is from Catherine Babayan. She says, thank you for this fantastic talk. I'm wondering where sovereignty enters into the news story, of the Armenian highlands to make the medieval cosmopolis in particular. How the transformation of Viodzor may be a story of the projection of legitimate power that is entangled with cosmology and the technologies used to transform nature. Could the operations of sovereignty tell us about tensions between visions of the order of the cosmology and the order of politics, tensions that are translated into spatial form?
Yes. No. What a fantastic question. So okay, I have to think in a lot of detail about that question, and I'm going to be thinking about that for a while. But I think yes. So again, I always struggle, and I've been struggling as I've talked. Had the privilege of talking to people about everyday cosmopolitanisms, about the book and about these projects, is like holding these things in my imagination at the same time, which is all again, and as I tried to say in like the end of this talk, like this idea about that imagining the more than human worlds and the ecological nature politics of this period is not to presume. I'm like speaking to the air because that's where Catherine is. Oh, hey, because that's where. It's not to say that this was a utopian or a harmonious society or social order, and that like there is absolute sovereignty at play here. And also, I mean, I think what is fascinating to me about the idea of political cosmography and cosmopolitanism is the idea that like that at the heart of a position of power is the presumption that you have made the world and set it in motion. That again, like the idea that like the prince is the seasons, your sovereign is nature, and which is imagining like Sasanian Persian kings like taking the stage with the crashing of thunder, and like this idea that like that you transcend the natural cultural divide is like that's absolutely like politically powerful, and like already and violent, because it means that like you have the power to exclude people from the world of possibility, to declare people and bodies impossible. I'm trying to like contain the world of that question in like the grain of sand of my answer. What I'm thinking, therefore, is yes. So the tension that emerges, I think, is like in the multivocality of like, and is watching these people struggle with the overlapping worlds in which they are trying to live, and the kind of plural that by putting on the robes of another person's sovereignty, you are having to negotiate the simultaneity of your power and beauty and their power, which I think, yeah, is potentially chaotic and fractious, and I mean, and I think we see that like paralleled in like the political landscape of this period, which is, yeah, I mean, this is one tiny world that is buffered on all sides by other worlds. And there's one more thing that I wanted to say in reference to this, and then I'm just going to continue thinking about this question, which is, yes, hospitality and care is something that and in particular this idea of an ecological sovereignty of care. So again, to be very clear about this, like this concept that has been most frequently written about by the kind of philosopher of science, Maria Puig de las Bellas Casas, that is about thinking about care for the worlds in which we live. But one of the things that she points out there is like, this is not like an old school mother goddess nurturing care for the world that we are living in. And again, as a kind of reorientation of our ideas about the Anthropocene, about climate change, about nature and culture. This is not the self-sacrificing mother care, but we have to think about this as like the real control and power that is inherent in that idea of pastoral care, of care for. And so like part of it is like understanding the real possibilities for harm and for violence that are kind of inherent in these ecologies of power. So yes, and so it's something, yeah, thank you. I'm gonna make myself stop there because otherwise I'm just gonna like think out loud and make you guys like watch me do it. Thank you for that question, Catherine. Yes, hi.
Okay, there we go. Thank you for a really fantastic narrative of the region and the time period. And I think the one thing that you talked about a bit was in one of the histories, they say like, okay, this is the end of the world.
Yes.
Right. And I think, well, in the living through a pandemic, I think it made me sort of be like, yes, that's what we all thought, right? Like for a moment, like that was the end. Mm-hmm. And so I just wondered, like, before the Mongols come, like what is the biggest transformation in society or in the landscape or in life ways between these earlier periods and then like that moment and the after?
Well, I think like thank you, that's a great question. And one that's I am going to have to make myself like answer very briefly because otherwise it's like, again, as Melanie introduced, it's like, where do I start telling the story of the 13th century? It's like, no, okay. Like, I think that what that's interesting about that is that there is no before time that is peaceful and like stable. And what I found really interesting about focusing on working in Argead-Sotin, which is south of Aparan, in the Vachichan administrated region where those inscriptions are from, closer to where Kyriakos Gantakidze was writing, is that there is a kind of reification of the Zakared period, which is when a kind of brief, it's like a taking of a breath between the Bagratid conquest of the region and the Mongol conquest. And but really it's a space-time. It's a false sense of kind of stability, which is created by just the absolute building boom of churches and caravanserais, and it's this very relatively brief period when people are again saying like, no, like let's make some history, like let's put a stamp on this landscape, and they had the resources to do it. And so because other than that, it's like things were changing all the time. I mean, I think like whether the ebbs and flows of Byzantine and Seljuk power in this region, of the just polities on polities and shifting boundaries through this era, which comes back to the challenge of thinking about territory and kingdom and sovereignty in this region, is that like for the Middle Ages are just a period of profound and constant, the only constant thing was change, essentially. But like what's interesting is that like the way that, again, like you put your finger on like the way that people perceive themselves as being being in the middle of a narrative, at the end of a narrative, or at the beginning of a narrative. And so like what I found so fantastic about juxtaposing those two accounts, like the narratives that are being written into the walls of buildings, this one is later, I'll stop pointing at the Saline Caravanserai, the walls of buildings and the things that are being written by historians, is like these people are telling two different kinds of stories. For one of them, this is a beginning, and for the other one, this is an end. But of course, again, it's also like just ironic that Kyriakos Gantakidze is writing, this is the end of time, and then he writes for another like 100 pages, right, about like the things that are happening and like, all the changes and what it's like being a captive scribe of the Mongols, and how he has, and he's, so like, thing, yeah, which is the also amazing thing about being, a fun thing about being an archaeologist is saying like, thinking about like the materiality versus textual narrative, where it's like, yes, like, buddy, but like you're writing, here we are holding the book that you were making. So even as you're saying like things are falling apart, like you're making a thing. Yeah, so that was a non-answer to your question, but which again, it like comes back to like the discontinuity between narrative and practice, essentially. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's great to have you here. I really appreciated the talk and the way you narrate the story, and really you showed the power of storytelling in just telling a very different story about a place.
Thank you.
But I appreciated your final comment about the way different storytelling shatters nationalist narratives. So this is really great. My question, and since you brought the deep historical approach and the nature culture and so on, I'm just wondering about the relationship between humans and non-humans.
Humans, yes.
Yeah, and like a multi-species approach, and the position and in your research in terms of the human-animal interaction, where they are, where are they in terms of stories, caregiving, the non-human in metaphors, the non-human in everyday life. So I'm just wondering if you can say anything about that multi-species in terms of the human interaction. Thank you.
I mean, so the question being, where are all the non-humans, and what do I think of them? I know so many horses. Well, so on the one hand, like something that I have like long loved about writing on the Silk Road is that the mind-blowing juxtapositions of scale and the kinds of agencies, like the things and the people that are responsible for this universe, this medieval and early modern universe of the Silk Road. And so many books and articles about the Silk Road will like juxtapose like the Mongol conquest, which spans a continent, and also like the lifespan of a silkworm, right? Like we have this entire world economy of the Silk Road universe that is like in many ways like so dependent on this incredibly fragile, small animal, and very, that has to be nurtured in very idiosyncratic ways, right? It only eats one thing. Which is why it becomes only women can tend them, and and anyway, so on the one hand. But in terms of like medieval Armenia, horses, one of the things that I found fascinating, and you can read about it in Everyday Cosmopolitanisms, is that within this world of political care, of like, okay, so who are the subjects? If we have these people who are putting themselves in positions of sovereignty and power, who do they think of as their subjects? Who is subject to their authority and to their hospitality and their care? And what I love about caravan inns in Armenia is that like it is both humans and animals. And so any of you have been to this tourist attraction, the Selim Caravanserai, but also the caravan inn that I excavated in Argatsotin, is that it is this monumental building that has spaces designated for humans and for animals. That like with the same attention that's given to the ashlars and the arches and the skylights is also given to the mangers for animals, and to making sure that they have the right slope so that they their hooves don't get fouled, and that they are comfortable as well. And because animals were important to the Silk Road, like you needed hundreds if not thousands of donkeys and horses and camels to like maintain this economy and to move through these landscapes. And so like that the idea is like that they are not forgotten, right? They are incorporated as well into the what is that sort of interpolative moment of the inscription as you walk into an Armenian church, or walk by the wall of an Armenian church, or if you walk into a caravan inn, whether at Selim, or we have the preserved inscription of the Hiratun, the guest house from Noravank Monastery in Viodzor. There's the interpolation, like it hails you. If you can read the inscription, then you read it and it's like, hey, you, welcome, but also like remember me and pray for me in memory, and like bless me with the memory, with bless me with your prayers as you continue along the road, essentially is the is the message. What I love about that is that the implied community that is being hailed there also includes these animals, right? Even though, of course, they can't read and they don't know, but like they are also being interpolated as subjects in that exchange, because like they're also being welcomed. And so like that's one example. I could like, and so it's something like thinking about pastoralism, thinking about again ecology and the importance of agriculture and viticulture and textile weaving as like something more than just economy, as really being part of a culture, like has made me try to pay more attention to again like the animals that that also make their way into art and are also like doing metaphorical labor. Allegorical and metaphorical labor is like a new hobby horse of mine. Something I think about all the time. It's like whose bodies do we use to do symbolic work? And so whether it's all the falcons and deer and lions and like that are become also made to participate in medieval politics, I think is interesting because it has real bearing on the lives of those creatures in ways that like a lot more in medieval like literary studies like people are paying attention to, I think. But it's interesting for archaeologists. Thank you for that question.
Hi, so thanks again for such an exciting presentation. I had another nature culture question.
Awesome.
So I was really interested in this sort of association between like the topography of Viodzor and like the misbehavior of humans, or like verdant like grasslands and good governance. So I was just curious, have you seen anything in Bellion or any other source maybe about the association between like a ruler and the strategic opportunities that a place like Viodzor can provide? So like rather than seeing Viodzor as like interpreted it negatively, to see it as almost as an opportunity that's reserved for a ruler?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I chose a kind of dark moment, mostly because I just love thinking about the slippage between rocks and water. And of course, I was having a conversation with Ani over the weekend. We were texting about medieval ideas about earthquakes and oceans all being kind of one big metaphorical thing. But yes. But also in Orbellion's history and in text more generally, like the landscape is a hero. It totally comes in and helps people. So there are these like mythical, like whether it's like the canyon sends a gust of warm air to like save a princess who is running, a virtuous woman. So now we have the other end of the spectrum, right? A virtuous woman who is like running from enemies and like leaps off of the cliffs, but is born to earth, carried to earth by the air of the canyons itself, or mystical springs that like sustain saints, right? Like there are miraculous and very benevolent capacities of the landscape as well. So it's also taking care of people and creating new possibilities all the time. There was another example I was trying to remember, but it's gone. But yes, absolutely. Yes. So I like to. No, I have no follow-up on that. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, thank you so much, Kay, for this wonderful talk, and thank you all for being here. And another round of applause for Kate. And
thank you guys so much. Like,
if you have questions, you can of course ask her more.
Yes. Thank you. I feel very selfish. Thank you for letting me think these thoughts in your company.